I love the book of Ruth. It is probably one of my favourite parts of the Bible. I don't know if you're allowed, or supposed to have favourite parts of the Bible, but it's just such a beautiful story, isn't it? It's, yeah, I don't know. I guess I'm just a bit of a hopeless romantic at heart. You know, the story of Ruth, it has tragedy. You have Elimelech and his wife Naomi and their two kids, Mahlon and Chilion, and they leave Israel because there's a famine there, and they relocate to Moab. And actually, if you were here 3-4 weeks ago, Tony helped us to see that actually what they were doing in doing that was actually turning away from God. They were doubting the promises that God had made to them as a people, that he would give them this land. They were doubting his goodness and his provision. And actually they were moving backwards to a people who had rejected God and were enemies of God's people. And of course it ended in calamity. It ended in the death of Naomi's husband and sons. And actually, as Naomi put it at the end of chapter 1, she said, "Don't call me Naomi," she told them. "Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me, the Almighty has brought misfortune on me." So Naomi saw that what had happened to her family was in part from God. In part it was judgment on them. And I think she was probably right. And yet, even in that first chapter, in amongst the darkness and the gloom, there was a silver lining, wasn't there? One of her son's wives, Ruth, who the book's named after, sticks with her. Despite Naomi trying to persuade her to go back to Moab, saying that there's really nothing she can do or give Ruth. And from a worldly perspective, she was right. But this is what Ruth says to her, back in chapter 1. Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." What an amazing statement. You see, Ruth is looking at the situation, the same situation as Naomi, but she sees it through the eyes of faith. Well, the story also has drama. They return back to Israel, and how are they going to survive? 2 women alone. And God provides, doesn't he? He provides through the godliness of Ruth, her bravery going out into the fields, her hard work, her care, gleaning each day. God provides for them through Boaz and his godly nature, his generosity, his care, his uprightness. And I think it was Luke helped us to see that those were pictures of God's kingdom. I love how chapter 2 puts it. In verse 3, "So she went out, entered a field, and began to glean behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she was working in the field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech, Naomi's husband. Just then, Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. 'The Lord be with you.'" Coincidence? Maybe not. And of course, it's a love story, isn't it? With a little prompting from Naomi, we saw last week, Ruth and Boaz have this touching nighttime meeting on the threshing floor. And I love the way that Jim brought out just how noble their characters are. When I read Ruth, it just stands out to me how different it is from films and TV and our sort of society today. And yet, purity like theirs is really beautiful and attractive, isn't it? There's something that really touches us about it. And as a few people have already mentioned tonight, it's a story of redemption, of redeeming love. Last week we saw that Naomi plans how they're going to get it. Ruth kind of claims it. Boaz promises it. And Ruth and Naomi are left anticipating it at the end of chapter 3. And we were left on a cliffhanger. Like all good stories, there's a bit of a twist. We discover that there is another man who's actually a closer relative than Boaz. And therefore, he has a greater claim to marry Ruth. So what's going to happen? Are Ruth and Boaz going to get married? I think a lot of you probably know the story already, but let's read Ruth chapter 4. Meanwhile, Boaz went up to the town gate and sat down there just as the guardian redeemer he had mentioned came along. Boaz said, "Come over here, my friend, and sit down." So he went over and sat down. Boaz took 10 elders of the town and said, "Sit here," and they did so. Then he said to the guardian redeemer, "Naomi, who has come back from Moab, is selling the piece of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. I thought I should bring the matter to your attention and suggest that you buy it in the presence of these seated here, and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, do so. But if you will not, tell me, so that I will know. For no one has the right to do it except you, and I am next in line." "I will redeem it," he said. Then Boaz said, "On the day that you buy the land from Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the dead man's widow, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property." At this, the guardian redeemer said, "Then I cannot redeem it, because I might endanger my own estate. You redeem it yourself. I cannot do it." Now, in earlier times in Israel, for the redemption and transfer of property to become final, one party took off his sandal and gave it to the other. This was the method of legalizing transactions in Israel. So the guardian redeemer said to Boaz, "Buy it yourself," and he removed his sandal. Then Boaz announced to the elders and all the people, "Today you are witnesses that I have bought from Naomi all the property of Elimelech, Kilion, and Mahlon. I have also acquired Ruth the Moabite, Mahlon's widow, as my wife, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property, so that his name will not disappear from among his family or from his hometown. Today you are witnesses." Then the elders and all the people at the gate said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the family of Israel. May you have standing in Ephrathah and be famous in Bethlehem. Through the offspring the Lord gives you by this young woman, may your family be like that of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah." So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. When he made love to her, the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. The women said to Naomi, "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout all Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth." Then Naomi took the child in her arms and cared for him. The women living there said, "Naomi has a son." And they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. This then is the family line of Perez. Perez was the father of Hezron. Hezron was the father of Ram. Ram was the father of Aminadab. Aminadab was the father of Nahshon. Nahshon was the father of Salmon. Salmon was the father of Boaz. Boaz was the father of Obed. Obed was the father of Jesse. And Jesse was the father of David. So, I wonder how many of us would have ended the story in the way that Ruth chapter 4 ends it. I've been thinking this week, I would have probably ended it something more along the lines of, so Boaz went straight to wait for the guardian redeemer. As soon as he saw him, he persuaded him to let him marry Ruth. Eventually, he agreed, and so Ruth and Boaz got happily married and lived happily ever after. And that is sort of the main storyline of what happens in chapter 4, isn't it? But there's also a lot of odd stuff about people taking their sandals off, and genealogies, and blessings. What is all that about? And actually, though these details might seem a little bit weird to us, they really help us to understand redemption more clearly. They help us to see the need for redemption. They help us to see that redemption is costly. And they help us to see the blessings of redemption. So those are kind of the three things we're going to be focusing on tonight. Well, firstly, the need of redemption. Why do Ruth and Naomi need to be redeemed? I think it's easy, as we've kind of recapped the story, to see Ruth and Naomi's immediate physical needs. They're poor. They've come back to Israel with next to nothing. I mean, Ruth is having to pick up the leftover bits of grain on the edges of the field. I was trying to think what the modern day equivalent of that would be. Maybe going down to Morrison's at the end of the day and seeing if they're giving away anything free. Or worse than that, sifting through the bins at the back afterwards. That's where Ruth and Naomi are at. And they're in danger. Two single women. People can take advantage of them, can con them, can pressure them. Or worse, they're kind of powerless, aren't they? And they seem without hope. Certainly that's how Naomi is feeling in that verse I read at the end of chapter 1. They're widows. Naomi's old. And Ruth is a looked down on foreigner. There are lots of physical circumstances that they need rescue from. But actually in verse 1 to 9, we see that that's not all that they need redemption for. Their need for redemption is deeper still. It's not only physical, but it's spiritual. I think that's why, as if I was retelling it, I'd be tempted to almost skip over verse 1 to 9, because I miss their spiritual needs. So really to understand this, we're going to need a bit of background. So Lizzie, would you be happy to read Leviticus 25, verses 23 to 28 for us?
The land must not be sold permanently, because the land is mine, and you reside in my land as foreigners and strangers. Throughout the land that you hold as a possession, you must provide for the redemption of the land. If one of your fellow Israelites becomes poor and sells some of their property, their nearest relative is to come and redeem what they have sold. If, however, there is no one to redeem it for them, but later on they prosper and acquire sufficient means to redeem it themselves, they are to determine the value for the years since they sold it and refund the balance to the one whom they sold it. They can then go back to their own property, but if they do not acquire the means to repay it, what was sold will remain in the possession of the buyer until the year of Jubilee. It will be returned in the Jubilee, and they can then go back to their property.
Okay, so this is part of the law of God that was given to Moses. Thank you, Lizzie, so much for reading that for us. So, if an Israelite, let's say Jeff, for example, was an Israelite, and he fell on hard times, and he could sell his plot of land to help make ends meet and to get food for his family. But if he did that, rather than him lose the land forever, God made provision in the law for his brother, let's say Andrew, you were Jeff's brother. It would be your duty to buy it back. It was a way, in a sense, to make sure that everyone was looked after. But actually, if you noticed in verse 23, the first verse Lizzie read, the reason for it is that the land itself has been given to them by God. They are not the ultimate owners of the land of Israel. It's a promised land. God is its owner. It is a present. It's actually part of the promise that he's made to Abraham. So it isn't just property. It's part of the blessing of being his chosen people. And so to lose it is to lose part of that blessing. It means that your children don't have an inheritance with God's people anymore. It's more than just physical, you see, there's a spiritual side. It says something about your relationship with God. And not just yours, but your families and your future generations. I think it's as serious as me today having to take my wedding ring to a pawnbroker to help make, to have enough money to eat. Imagine if I had to do that. It would be more than just the money. There'd be something in my heart, it would be sort of hurt. And I think it would say something to Becky, my wife, but also to our family and to you guys of how desperate we were. So redemption is buying back the land. It's Andrew paying the ransom price that's needed to restore Jeff and Helen's future and hope as part of God's people. So that's part of what's going on here. But there's another part of the law that's going to help us understand what's going on at this town gate. So Yemi this time, if you would read for us Deuteronomy 25, verses 5 to 10. So that's Deuteronomy 25, verses 5 to 10.
If brothers are living together, and one of them dies without a son, his widow must not marry outside the family. Her husband's brother shall take her and marry her and fulfill the duty of a brother-in-law. The first son she bears shall carry on the name of the dead brother, so that his name will not be blotted out from Israel. However, if a man does not want to marry his brother's wife, she shall go to the elders at the town gate and say, "My husband's brother refuses to carry on his brother's name in Israel. He will not fulfill the duty of a brother-in-law to me." Then the elders of his town shall summon him and talk to him. If he persists in saying, "I do not want to marry her," his brother's widow shall go up to him in the presence of the elders, take off one of his sandals, spit in his face, and say, "This is what is done to the man who will not build up his brother's family line. That man's line shall be known in Israel as the family of the unsandaled."
Okay. So in this passage, again from the law, you see if an Israelite man is married and he dies without children, then his brother is supposed to marry his wife, have a child with her, and that child will continue his dead brother's family line. Now, it does sound odd to us. But again, I think you see the connection with the last section from Leviticus. It's about being part of God's chosen people. It's about that family line continuing and continuing to be part of God's family. It's God's blessing even to the dead person. And actually, we see that in the language used in Ruth 4. You see, the need of redemption, it's not just physical, it's spiritual. It's not just about now, but it includes the future. And it's not just for Naomi and Ruth and their particular physical circumstances, but it's the whole family and the future of that family. I was thinking about SRM as a whole might help us understand it a bit better. One of our focuses in SRM is to be a church that is reaching the next generation. And why do we do that? Well, we aren't thinking about passing on land, but the gospel. We want the next generation to hear about Jesus. It's what Paul was talking about, that they might know the blessing of having Jesus as their king, as their saviour, of knowing him as their friend and their redeemer. And it's one of our prayers for the new building, isn't it? That it might allow the good news about Jesus to keep going out in Bradford for another 130 years and beyond that. God's blessing is something to be passed on. So Ruth and Naomi are not just in a bad way physically, but spiritually. Without a redeemer, they are at the end of the line for their family. Their place in God's people is going to go to someone else. They need redemption, and they need a redeemer. Now, verse 1 to 9 also help us to see the cost of redemption. And that's actually shown by the actions of this closer relative. You see, he's not willing to marry Ruth because it might risk his inheritance. And it's not clear from the passage exactly how it will do that. It could be possibly because she's a Moabitess, and he's worried about how that might affect his position in God's people. It could be that he's worried that she might only have one son, and that then that son will inherit both properties, and somehow the family names are combined. But whatever the reason is, and it doesn't really matter, it's clear that there's a cost to redemption. And that this closer guardian redeemer is not willing to pay it. And actually, that means there's a cost and a risk for Boaz as well in redeeming Ruth. And again, it's not just a physical cost, it's not just the money that he has to pay for the land. For all that Ruth is amazing and such an amazing model of godliness to us, this closer guardian redeemer shows that redemption is costly, it's risky. So Ruth and Naomi desperately need redemption. We see that redemption is costly. And finally, we see the blessing of redemption in verses 11 to 15. Actually, if you look at the passage, it's split up by a title in our church Bibles, but there's actually a blessing sandwich. So, in verses 11 to 12, we have the blokes, the elders, at the town gate, blessing Boaz. In verses 14 to 15, we have the women in the neighbourhood blessing Naomi and Obed and praising God for all that he's done for them. And in the middle, verse 13, we have the culmination, the high point of the love story. Boaz and Ruth get married, and God blesses them with a son. And you see that the blessings of redemption that we see in these verses, they reverse all of the tragedy that we saw in the first two chapters of Ruth, don't they? And actually, as we've been going through Ruth, I've not always been able to make it in the evenings. And so I listen to it while I'm mopping the floors in the community centre. And I've really been struck by the third character in Ruth. You have Ruth and Boaz, and then there's also Naomi. And actually, I think I've come to see she's, at least by the amount she's spoken about, the main character of the book. In chapter 1, well, she was left with no husband. She's buried both her children, and she has no hope of a family. And yet now, the women in her neighbourhood are praising God because he's provided for her. She was a widow with no inheritance. Now she has a redeemer. She's lost her sons, and yet God gave her a daughter-in-law who was better than 7 sons. And she also has a baby on her knee, a surrogate son. She was hopeless and powerless. And now they say her life is renewed in her old age. And that bitterness at the end of chapter 1 has been turned to the joy of holding a new baby. The blessings of redemption. And what the elders say also shows this. They look back to 2 moments from Genesis. Both ones where God worked through a messy family. Rachel and Leah, who were competing for Jacob's love. And yet God turned that around and used it to build up a family, the family of Israel, a family of 12 brothers, who the 12 tribes of Israel would come from. And Perez, who is the son of Tamar, to her father-in-law, Judah. You can see that that's messy. I don't have to go into the details. And yet the family of Perez, if you trace them through, they go on to be the leaders of the clan of Judah. You see, God has an amazing track record of taking difficult, messy situations, ones that have been spoilt by sin, and redeeming them, turning them around. We were thinking a bit of that this morning in what Jesus says. Well, where do these blessings of redemption come from ultimately? Well, verse 13 in the middle of this blessing sandwich actually is the first time in Ruth that we hear about God acting directly. Up until now, God has been at work in the background, through Ruth, through Boaz, through circumstance. And now at the finale, the author wants us to realise that it has been God working all along. And so he says, so Boaz took Ruth and she became his wife. When he made love to her, the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. And the book ends by showing how these blessings came true. It finishes by telling us the line of David. he shows us how Naomi and Ruth and Boaz's story fit into God's bigger plan, his bigger story. As I mentioned, Ruth is a favourite book of mine. It's just so rich. And I was thinking actually you could use Ruth to advertise any of the Lent courses we're doing. Thinking about poverty and money, thinking about singleness and how to be godly in singleness, thinking about marriage and how to be godly in marriage, thinking about the whole storyline of the Bible, as we're going to think about in just a second as we finish. I can't remember the other one, but never mind. But I just want to draw out one thing as I finish. I love the way that Ruth sits between Judges, which, if you think about the Bible story, is the bigger story of Israel's downward spiral into sin, and 1 Samuel, which is the search for God's anointed king who's going to bring about his blessing and redemption. And in the middle, you get a very personal story of an ordinary family, and yet it mirrors those stories on either side, doesn't it? You see, God is the God of the big and the small, of nations and individuals, and he can redeem both. And yet this story of redeeming love is pointing to something even bigger than just the story of the nation Israel. It points to the story of redeeming love that's at the heart of the universe. One thing I've been pondering as I've been thinking about Ruth, I'm often challenged by Muslim friends of mine as to whether the Bible can be believed or not. And I've just been struck by how Ruth, in a sense, contains the whole storyline of the Bible within it. The story of redemption that's at the heart of the universe. Before the creation of the world, God had planned it. The Trinity knew what they were going to do. Just like Naomi and their family had left God's promised land, didn't trust him and obey him, well, we see Adam and Eve representing the whole of humanity doing exactly the same thing in the Garden of Eden, don't we? Not trusting God's goodness and his provision. And yet God still loves the world, and he patiently bears with the rebellious creation, just like we see his patience with Naomi. Throughout the Old Testament, he repeatedly shows that he is the Redeemer, the ultimate Redeemer, redeeming the people of Israel from slavery, from trouble, from their enemies, from death, from sin. And throughout the Old Testament storyline, he keeps promising to send a Redeemer from the family of Eve, from the family line of Abraham, from the family of King David, and therefore from the family of Boaz and Ruth. A Redeemer who would be even more noble and loving than Boaz. One who would see the need for redemption, not just the immediate circumstances that people are in, but the true need for redemption, the far deeper problem of sin, and one who would be willing to pay the price and cost of redemption with his own life. Jesus said, "For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many." And he did that to redeem a bride, a people who in and of themselves have no claim on him, worse, who've rejected him, and to make them beautiful, like Ruth, noble. You see, the story of Ruth, Boaz, and Naomi reflects something of the redeeming love story that's at the heart of the universe. And so it reflects our story. And I just want to finish by asking, where are you in that story? Are you wandering in the wilderness, like Naomi in chapter 1? Do you feel cut off from God? Or do you feel like a foreigner, like Ruth after the return? You come to church, but you just feel out of place. Well, look at Ruth, at the story of Ruth, and see God's heart. He loves you and he longs to draw you back in and welcome you. Are you gleaning on the edges of the field? maybe you've been around church for a while and you see the goodness, but you haven't yet come to Jesus' feet and asked for his forgiveness and redemption, just like Ruth did to Boaz. Well, then look at this story. Come to him. Find your refuge in him, under his wings. I think for most of us here, we've probably done that already. And sometimes we feel a bit like Boaz, trying to follow him and navigate all the difficult circumstances of life. And we know that following Jesus is hard. It's risky. And maybe it's really cost you. Maybe that's been family or friends or money or time. Well, as we finish looking at Ruth, I just want you to see again that this is a story about what Jesus has done for you, first and foremost. How much he loves you and how worth it is to follow him. But also be reminded that God is at work in the small things, in our families, in our lives. Remember that your story is wrapped up into his bigger story. And he will bring the blessings of redemption. Often many of them are actually probably present. And just the troubles are sort of eclipsing them slightly, and we just need to refocus our vision. But there will be lots that we're still anticipating and looking forward to. But they are certain. Just as God worked in Boaz and Ruth to bring King David and ultimately to bring about the true Redeemer, Jesus. So, we're going to have, do we have 5 minutes for discussion? Yep. So just to start, how has the story of Ruth encouraged you? Or how has it challenged you? How does their story of redemption help us to appreciate our redemption? And then how do we reflect God's heart for the poor in practical ways? What does kind of the story of Ruth have to tell us about that and to challenge us in that? So, 3 things for us to discuss.